Today we're taking a look at the GTX 1070 8GB graphics card and its performance going into 2025. The model that I have here today is the Gigabyte Gaming 8G. This once mid-range GPU is more of a real tight budget used graphics card option because there's just so many more used options that are available because this graphics card is a little bit older. With that being said though, you can pick these up really cheap. Sometimes you can get local deals anywhere from the $50 to $80 region. I really like this GPU for an entry-level or budget gaming system since you do have 8GB of video memory and you can leverage FSR in order to squeeze out a little bit more performance. The GTX 1070 GPU features 1,920 CUDA cores, 120 texturing units, 64 ROPs, and 8GB of GDDR5 memory, which operates also at 8 gigabits per second. As for the memory bus, the width is 256 bits, which is actually quite decent. As for the gaming 8G model that I have here, there is a slight pre-overclock on it. The boost clock on the core is 1,822 MHz, and in the OC mode, it's 1,784 MHz. Again, like I said, I think buying this card used at a lower price is really where the overall value will shine for the GTX 1070. As for the video displays, we do have one HDMI 2.0B port, as well as 3 total DisplayPort 1.4 ports, and I believe you can use any 3 of the video outputs at one time. Now that we have some of the specs out of the way, let's take a look at some of the synthetic and gaming benchmarks. I'll be pairing the GTX 1070 8GB with my Ryzen 9700X on the ASRock X670E PG Lightning motherboard with 32GB of G.Skill DDR5 6000 CL28 memory. Most of us are familiar with TimeSpy. It's a synthetic benchmark and it's a little bit older these days, but still kind of the gold standard for testing GPUs. The GTX 1070 scores relatively well for its age in my opinion. Over the 3 test passes, the overall score averaged 6,828 points, with a GPU score of 6,264 points on average. The CPU scored about 13,972 points for reference. Not bad for a GPU that was released in 2016, in my opinion. The first game that we're taking a look at is Cyberpunk 2077. I tested this game at 1080p high and 1080p high with FSR quality enabled. For the 1080p high results without upscaling, the card unfortunately was not able to hit 60 FPS on average. Across all the test runs that I ran, it saw about 48.3 FPS on average, with lows somewhere in the mid to 30 FPS range. Flipping on FSR quality though, the GTX 1070 averaged about 65.16 FPS across the test runs, which made for a much smoother experience. This also enabled the lows to be boosted up into the 52 FPS range, which definitely felt way better during normal gameplay. FSR at 1080p, even in the quality preset mode, isn't ideal, but overall, I think this can definitely still be an enjoyable experience. And in my opinion, I would definitely play this at 1080p high with FSR quality enabled. Next up, we have the Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail benchmark. This game is relatively popular, and it's a bit easier to run on most graphics hardware. For the 1080p desktop standard preset with no upscaling enabled, we're looking at an average overall benchmark score of about 19,536 points. A solid experience in my opinion. When we flip the preset quality to the high mode, we definitely notice the increased visuals, but we will take a little bit of a performance hit. The GTX 1070 averaged about 12,582 points in this test. I did want to take a look at 1080p maximum, but that preset was a little too much for the GTX 1070 to handle. So I actually turned on the maximum benchmarks with FSR always enabled. The average score was about 14,159 points, which is definitely a nice uplift. For 1080p, in my opinion, I would probably recommend playing this with the high preset with no upscaling enabled, and if you're interested, maybe a slight overclock. That'll definitely get the FPS up in those heavy battle scenes. As for the 1440p desktop standard preset testing, the GPU averaged about 12,301 points, which I think is a decent showing for 1440p. The desktop high preset, however, took a little bit of a dip. We went down into an average of about 8250 to 8300 points. The lows were definitely in the 30 FPS range. It's playable, but you'll notice. I think if you want to play 1440p high, you're looking at overclocking and FSR being enabled. As for the max quality at 1440p, well, you probably guessed it. The GTX 1070 8GB definitely can't handle it well. So I did run this with FSR enabled and always turned on, and the card averaged about 9350 points. I would say with a slight overclock, this could be an even better experience, but that's entirely up to you. Most of the GTX 1070s will allow for another 50, maybe 150 MHz on the core, and a lot of them got some pretty solid overclocks on the memory, between 2 to 400 MHz from what I've read. And lastly here, I ran the Black Myth Wukong benchmark. This game is super popular. Everybody was playing it in 2024, but it was very difficult to run for most graphics cards, especially the older graphics cards, and in general, a lot of PCs kind of struggled with it. For the 1080p low preset with no upscaling enabled, we're looking at an average of about 48.3 FPS, which in my opinion is pretty good for an older GPU. This is definitely playable if you're gaming on a GTX 1070. If we want to bump up that quality to the 1080p medium preset, however, things do get a little bit rough, with the average dropping to about 36.3 FPS, and the lows at 1080p medium are just under 30, right around 29 FPS. Whereas when we were playing with 1080p low preset, the lows were in the 41 to about 42 FPS range, which was a lot better to play with. I did want to give the medium preset a try, so for the last Wukong set of testing, I ran the 1080p medium preset with FSR enabled, running at 75% resolution scaling. The average FPS throughout the benchmark runs was between 48 to 49 FPS, with the lows in the 39 to 40 FPS range. That's really not bad for having FSR enabled. Some people, however, are not going to like the image quality for a 1080p image with FSR enabled, even when you have not a ton of scaling and you increase those quality presets. In my opinion, it's kind of a wash. If you like the 1080p medium preset with FSR enabled, running at about 70 to 80% FSR scaling, I say go with that. If you prefer the 1080p low preset with no FSR upscaling enabled, go with that instead. Either way, I think that if you're adventurous and you want to overclock a little bit, you're probably going to be able to gain maybe 5% in terms of the average and lows, so it could be something worthwhile looking at. MSI Afterburner is free and it's super easy to use. All of this being said though, I still think it's awesome that we can enjoy a game that came out in 2024 that is super hard to run on most systems on the GTX 1070 8GB GPU. But if you've held on to it this long, or you just happen to pick one up really cheap over time, you can still enjoy the Black Myth Wukong story. During all of the game testing, the card was generally speaking consuming around 130 to 140 watts. This was measured in the Riva Tuner software, but I did note in my research that some models can go up to 150, maybe 160 watts. In terms of noise output, the stock profile for this card has it running relatively quiet around the 32 to 33 dBA area. The gaming 8G heatsink is relatively big on this card, and I think it does look nice. It's coming with 3 fans and a good overall design for a card that consumes this much power and puts off this amount of heat. In the testing, I didn't find that I needed to crank the fan speed up in order to keep the temps down, which is very nice. But you do have that option, especially if your ambient temperatures are warmer or if you want to overclock. Every couple of degrees does matter when you're trying to eke out all of the performance from that core. The gaming model doesn't have any of that fancy RGB stuff, but it does have a nice shroud and a decent looking backplate, and that's fine in my opinion. This is really meant to be a solid, budget used or refurbished kind of card that you can get cheap in 2025. In my opinion, I wouldn't really pay more than 80 to 90 bucks, and I think if you look locally on Marketplace or Craigslist, you might even be able to pick one of these up in the $50 to $80 price region. In that area, as long as the card is functioning fine and not totally destroyed by a miner, for example, I think this is a real value pick. With all of this being said though, if you're looking to buy a new GPU, I'd probably have to steer you towards a 4060, a 7600, or the new Intel B580 Battlemage GPU. They're all going to cost quite a bit more than this, but they are new and do have warranty on them. If you found this video helpful, I would definitely appreciate it if you tossed a like on the video to let YouTube know to recommend this to other people who are researching the GTX 1070's performance in 2025. These videos take a whole lot of time for me to put together, so it would mean a lot. If you're interested in gaming computer and home lab type server builds, I would say get subscribed to the channel and then ring that bell for upload notifications. Until next time, keep on gaming.